Hi guys, Biden announced 4 new racial equity executive orders. Housing justice, prison reform, discrimination against Asians, and more. Sounds scary, but let's see what it's actually about. Maybe it's just another set of empty declarations just to please some radical left. First, housing discrimination. In US, as everywhere in the world, people source themselves quite efficiently. Rich people tend to live in the rich neighborhood, and poor people tend to live in the poor ones. Some immigrants historically prefer to live with the people from their country of origin, or at least from the people from the same culture as they are. Major US cities have Chinese, Russian, Mexican, Jewish, and many more different districts. Nothing is wrong here, right? But Democrats disagree. They demand some diversity. The most problematic for them are black neighborhoods, which are full of poverty, drugs, and crime. Why it's so bad there? Democrats have a very easy answer. It's racism. Long time ago, cities were officially divided into different zones. This is called redlining. And each zone was designed for a certain class to live in. And blacks and other people of color were denied to live in those prestigious zones and had to live in the zone full of crime. According to Democrats, to solve this problem, you just need to build a low-income housing into middle-income neighborhood. Or just subsidize the existing middle-class dwelling so that low-income people can move in. This is called public housing. The main assumption here is that if you put some low-incomer from high-crime neighborhood into the middle-class one, he or she will potentially get a better education and perhaps will eventually get into the middle class by himself or herself. The reality is quite different. After 50 plus years of that experiment, there is absolutely zero evidence that any of those people from public housings are performing better in their high school standardized tests or that they are getting better positions in their lives. In the same time, the crime rates for those middle-income neighborhoods are going up and the residents are quite unhappy. Particularly vocal are black middle-class residents because they find it extremely unfair that they had to work all their life really hard, take those mortgages to be able to move from high-crime neighborhood to these good ones, and now they have to accept and subsidize the low-lifers. Despite all of this, Democrats are still pushing that idea. That's the prehistory. Let's look what actual Biden's order is talking about. Diverse and inclusive communities strengthen our democracy. Any proof to that false statement? If you put anything with the word diversity, you don't need to prove it. During the 20th century, federal, state, and local governments systematically implemented racially discriminatory housing policies that contributed to segregated neighborhoods and inhibited equal opportunities and the chances to build the wealth for Black, Latino, Asian American, and other undeserved communities. This is true, but it was outlawed 52 years ago. What about now? Ongoing legacies of residential segregation and discrimination remain ever present in our society. This includes a racial gap in home ownership. Well, Asian Americans earn 32% more on average than the white ones, and as the result, they have a better housing, right? Does that mean residential segregation makes Asians superior to whites? A persistent under-evaluation of properties owned by families of color. Are they suggesting that the house bought from the black family will be 20% off comparing to the situation if the same house was sold by a white family? That's interesting. I usually thought when you're buying a house, you're interacting with the broker, not really with the family. And systemic barriers to safe, accessible, and affordable housing for people of color, immigrants, individuals with disabilities, and lesbians, gay, bisexual, transgender, gender non-conforming, and queer LGBTQ+ individuals. Well, I lived in San Francisco for 3+ years, and I'd say I was an immigrant, and I was somehow managed to rent a very nice house in the city, even without any credit score at that point. I just said I worked for Google, and that's all. And putting LGBTQ+ on that issue is quite unfair because Castro in San Francisco and Chelsea in New York City are basically a prime real estate and it's the most desirable place to live in the city. What are you talking about, crazy Biden? Then the document talks about mortgage lending to black people and it's somehow unfair without any proofs as always. We know that banks are interested in making money, not in discriminating people. And all the mortgages are made according to your credit score, not according to your race. Another hoax. Many urban interstate highways were deliberately built to pass through black neighborhoods, often requiring the destruction of housing and other local institutions. Well, if you look at San Francisco Bay Area, which I'm familiar with, this is simply not true. Maybe you know some examples of that. Let me know in the comments. People of color are overrepresented among those experiencing homelessness. This is not true for Asians, they are underrepresented. Maybe it has something to do with the income, not the race. In addition, people of color disproportionately bear the burdens of exposure to air and water pollution. Who pollutes the air and water? White rednecks? and growing risks of housing instability from climate crisis like extreme heat, flooding, and wildfires. I love they put climate change everywhere. Apparently all CO2 comes to the black neighborhoods just to heat them up and avoiding somehow the white ones. Well, if you live in the place which is exposed to the flooding danger, sooner or later your place will be destroyed. But why people still decide to live there? Because you can buy a cheap government-sponsored FEMA insurance, which will reimburse all your losses in case of a disaster. If the insurances were sold by the market prices, people would not be living in the flood-prone areas. Finally, wildfires. The first image which you have in your head is probably California. And in California you have only 6% of black population. And most of them live in San Francisco Bay Area or Los Angeles, far away from all the areas where actual fire happens. What kind of manipulation is that? To fully debunk this whole nonsense, let's look at the redlining map of San Francisco from 1937. Biden executive order still claims this map has a real impact on today's life. So here green is the first class areas, blue is the second one, yellow is the third one, and the red is the fourth, the shittiest one. Presidio and Forest Hill are still first-class areas in San Francisco where rich people live. But Richmond and Sunset are mostly Asian neighborhoods now. Basically, it's a new Chinatown. These are quite okay districts, but not really the first class as the map suggests. And all these Asians came there quite recently and pushed out previous white residents because they were financially more successful. Castro and Mission are currently prime neighborhoods for tech people because it's very close to the highway and most of them work down in Silicon Valley. According to that map, these are shitty neighborhoods. Hunters Point, the not so pretty neighborhood near the old dock, is still home to the large black community in San Francisco. Also keep in mind that San Francisco is the most liberal city in the United States. And in 1970 there were 30% of blacks and 30% of Asians. And in 2018 there are only 5% blacks and 35% of Asians. Clearly, it has nothing to do with racism or redlining. Returning to the Biden's order, it's a long and boring text, and there are basically zero concrete actions. Basically, it's a call to evaluate the situation by different agency. Nothing real. Next order is about federal prisons. Basically, US government will not sign any new contract with the private prisons. Well, most of the countries in the world use only government prisons, and it seems to be fine. But let's read the justification of that order. More than 2 million people are currently incarcerated in the United States, including a disproportionate number of people of color. Smells very leftist again. There is a broad consensus that our current system of mass incarceration imposes significant cost and hardships on our societies and communities, and doesn't make us safer. Well, there is a consensus on the high cost, that's true. But it does make our society safer. We have clear data from 90s when they actually started to put more criminals behind the bar, and this actually reduced the crime in US a lot. That was not the single reason, but one of them. To decrease incarceration levels, we must reduce profit-based incentives to incarcerate by phasing out the federal government's reliance on privately operated criminal detention facilities. Wait, the law enforcement and the whole judicial system still belongs to government. Private prisons can't convict anyone. What kind of manipulation is that? Then the text arguing that the private prisons don't treat people in the humane way, but the government ones for some unknown reason do. Let's move to the next order. Asian discrimination. You know, Asians are always excluded from leftist calculations. They earn more than whites, they are more law-abiding, they have better educations than white. It doesn't really fit in their America is racist theory. Apparently, according to that orders, all Asians and Pacific Islanders are at great danger because of COVID. Why is like that? Because COVID came from China, and all the white rednecks wants to discriminate them because of that. First of all, I thought that white rednecks can differentiate Chinese from Japanese, Filipino, or Hawaiian, but apparently not, according to that document. So, the federal government must recognize that it has played a role in furthering the xenophobic sentiments through the actions of political leaders, including references to COVID-19 pandemic by geographic location of its origin. This is super leftist. Previously, all the pandemics were called by their geographical names. For example, MERS in 2012 is Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. Also, we had Spanish flu 100 years ago. And CNN and other fake news called this Wuhan virus at the beginning, but then corrupt WHO decided to rename it to COVID-19. Basically, the point of this executive order is to prohibit mentioning China in any COVID-related documents. Nice, very impactful. And the last one, establishing a relationship with tribal leaders. Basically, now there will be some special people in Biden's administration which will be paid by your taxes, who will talk to the native communities about their preferred alcohol drinks. Okay, that's all. Biden's executive order are all about Soviet-style Marxist propaganda and luckily have nothing to do with real life. Thanks for watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you next time. Bye!